AM Eastern Daylight Saving Time 8 o'clock Ben Glaze at Ben Glaze every week when Theresa May arrives for It's Very Sweet October 31st, 2018 7:58 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:58 PMQs 7:48 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:48 7:45 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:45 7:41 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:41 Lisa OCarroll George Eustice, the farming minister, told the Environment Committee that he hoped the agriculture bill would get royal assent before Brexit and get to the House of Lords before the end of the year or early next. This will fuel NFU concerns that the bill is being whizzed through because of Brexit, leaving little time for proper scrutiny and debate. 7:39 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:39 Zuckerberg asked to give evidence to International Grand Committee on Fake News 7:20 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:20 David Davis clarifies his view on no-deal Brexit, saying any plan based on checkers won't pass. Commons updated at 7:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:14 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:14 Lisa OCarroll Environment Secretary Michael Gove has come under fire after he said there was no scope for guarantees in his new agriculture bill over chlorinated chicken imported after Brexit. Tory MP Neil Parish, chair of the Environment Select Committee, told Gove that such a guarantee would merely be putting his previous declarations about food safety into law. At a committee hearing this morning, he asked, "What harm would it do to put guarantees in the bill? I don't see why you are so adamant it can't go there when your whole raison d'etre of British agriculture in the future is to have higher welfare standards." Concerns about the bill, which represents the biggest reform to agriculture since the 1940s, have already been raised by the National Farmers Union for its lack of emphasis on food post-Brexit. Gove, who was giving evidence before the committee on Tuesday, said he shared the sentiments of Parish but that the place for guarantees was the trade bill, not the agriculture bill. Guarantees were outside the scope of this bill, Gove told him. Parish said this was to duck the issue as there would no time to debate agriculture standards in the trade debate. He went on, "I see no protection, because we couldn't get it in the trade bill, and now you say we can't get it in the agriculture bill." Parish said there was no suggestion that American chicken was unsafe to eat, but that their animal welfare approach was completely different with higher antibiotics in poultry, for example. He explained, "They take many more risks through their production, they are more intensive and then they whack it with chlorine." 7:05 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time 7:05 Commons clerk says it's not clear whether referendum amendment would invalidate Brexit agreement vote later in the Brexit committee. Sir David Natzler, the clerk of the Commons, was by the Labour MP Pat McFadden about amendments demanding a second referendum. Natzler said that a non-statutory vote demanding a referendum would not be legally binding on the government. An extension of the point he made earlier, c. 10:10 a.m., but he also said that, if a majority of MPs were to vote for a second referendum, that would have considerable political force. He said, if the House were to agree that there should be a referendum before X or after X, that would have no statutory effect. No referendum follows as a result. But if there is a majority of members of the House of Commons that voted for it, I think you would be very unwise to say that has no effect. It would have, I assume, a considerable political effect. One obvious point is that, if a majority of MPs vote for X, even if they are not voting on legislation, ministers know there is always the good chance they will be able to vote for the same thing attached as an amendment to the bill at some point in the future. McFadden then asked Natzler what would happen if the motion approving the Brexit deal were approved by MPs, with an amendment demanding a second referendum. At this point it is important to go back to the EU Withdrawal Act, passed earlier this year. In Section 13(1)(b), it says, the negotiated withdrawal agreement and the framework for the future relationship have been approved by a resolution of the House of Commons on a motion moved by a Minister of the Crown. But, as the Commons Library Briefing (PDF) points out, the Act does not say what would happen if that motion gets amended. Will it still be valid and sufficient to allow the withdrawal agreement to be ratified? Or will it contaminate it? The government view is that this would contaminate the motion and stop the treaty being ratified. In a recent memo to the Commons Procedure Committee (PDF), the Brexit Department said, there is no express provision in Section 13 for the agreement to be partially or conditionally approved. Amendments could therefore have the effect, whether deliberately or accidentally, of inhibiting the government's legal ability to ratify the agreement. For example, if amendments were passed which purported to offer approval, but only subject to changes being made to the text of either the withdrawal agreement or the future framework, this would, in effect, amount to Parliament not approving the documents that were put with. In this circumstance, the government would therefore not have the authority to ratify the withdrawal agreement. Likewise, if amendments made approval conditional, such as on an event occurring, note, the memo here is referring to a second referendum although it does not say so explicitly, this could prevent ratification if the condition introduced any doubt that the government had the required approval to proceed with ratification. At the very least this would invite litigation, bringing with it consequent uncertainty. So McFadden wanted to whether Natzler agreed. What would happen if the motion went through with a second referendum amendment attached? Unfortunately, Natzler said that was one for the lawyers. He replied, that is the expensive question, meaning I am not a lawyer. That is the big statutory question. The government's memorandum, that you will have read, to the Procedure Committee expresses their concern that if the resolution is spoilt, which is my shorthand, by anything other than the pure milk of what it says in 13(1)(b), it casts doubt as to whether or not that gate has opened for them to be able eventually to ratify it. So they think it casts doubt on it. It obviously casts doubt on it if you have a future conditional amendment which they are not able to meet. But that is a question for their lawyers. If such an amendment were passed, and then incidentally the motion as amended were agreed, it would then be for lawyers to determine whether 13(1)(b) as condition had been met. It's not a procedural question. 6:10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. 6:10 May can ignore any non-statutory vote demanding alternative Brexit plan, Commons clerk says in his evidence to the Brexit Committee. Sir David Natzler, the clerk of the Commons, said that, even if MPs passed a motion or motions backing an alternative approach to Brexit, the government would be able to ignore them. He was talking in the context of MPs voting on various motions about Brexit alongside the government's one just asking the Commons to back Theresa May's deal. When MPs are voting on legislation, the government does, of course, have to comply. But in votes of this kind, the government would be able to ignore them, he said. In response to a question from the Tory Brexiter John Whittingdale, who said the government would not have to pay any attention to these votes, Natzler said, that is correct. There's not statutory obligation. So let us say there's a majority in favor of a different sort of future trading arrangement to that envisaged in the future framework. Let us say indeed there was a majority for a number of different trading arrangements in different resolutions, because the only precedents close to this are the House of Lords votes in 2003 and 2007, when the business of the House motion explicitly allowed for mutually contradictory resolutions to be passed. The House may come out in favor of, I don't know, of Canada plus, or Norway minus, and all sorts of things. Does the government then have to go and renegotiate? No. It then tries to get its principal motion through, with whatever it is proposing to the House. A few minutes later Whittingdale asked for confirmation that none of these votes would be binding on the government, unless they were amendments to statute. Natzler confirmed that was correct. Sir David Natzler photograph. Parliament TV updated at 6:14 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. 5:43 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. 5:43 The Commons Brexit Committee has just started taking evidence from Sir David Natzler, Clerk of the Commons, about how the Brexit meaningful vote could proceed. You can watch the session here. The government agreed early last year that MPs should have a vote on the final Brexit deal. The opposition has demanded a meaningful vote, implying a vote that could actually change the terms of the deal, for example, by making it conditional on a second referendum, but ministers want it to be a straightforward yes, no, take it or leave it vote. Dominic Raab, the Brexit secretary, made this clear recently in a letter to the Procedure Committee. Quite what will happen is still, at this stage, anyone's guess. It depends on the Commons standing orders, not always simple, how they are interpreted by the Speaker, not always predictable, and what procedural visas the government may deploy, because the Commons can always vote to change its own rules. Natzler is not a figure who normally speaks in public, but as Commons clerk he is effectively the chief umpire who decides what is and is not allowed under the rules, and so his evidence could prove interesting. As my colleague Dan Savage reports, in written evidence submitted in advance of today's hearing, Natzler suggested a rare procedure could be used to allow MPs to vote on multiple options. Here is Natzler's written evidence, PDF. And here is a Commons Library briefing, PDF, entitled, A User's Guide to the Meaningful Vote, which explains the issues in some detail. Updated at 5:50 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time, 5:24 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time, 5:24 May will get a deal through Parliament. Leading Brexiter David Davis predicts Theresa May will turn up for PMQs today in a rather less precarious position than people might have expected a week or so ago. The budget has been very well received in Tory circles, and it has not unravelled, in the sense that no one has discovered any enormous problem with it that was not apparent when Philip Hammond sat down at around 4:30 p.m. on Monday afternoon. What people are saying about its strengths and weaknesses hasn't changed much in the last 36 hours. That doesn't always happen with these events. On the day of PMQs after Hammond's first budget, he had to announce a massive U-turn that effectively ripped up one of his main fiscal proposals. There was also another development last night that will cheer the PM. As Sky News reports, David Davis, who resigned as Brexit secretary because he is opposed to May's Chequers plan, told a meeting that he thought May would get a deal through Parliament. Fear of what would happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit, fear that Davis thinks is somewhat unfounded, would be enough to persuade MPs opposed to what she's offering, he argued. He said, "Terror will win. The fear of no deal, I think, we haven't had a chance to talk about it much, but I think that's an irrational fear of no deal, or a WTO, World Trade Organization, deal. That will win and there will be a deal. It may take a few passes, there may be a deal passes in Brussels and fails in Westminster." The Sun's Harry Cole also quotes Davis saying, Harry Cole, Admiral Harry Cole, Police Car EDT says May will get a deal through EU and Parliament, Terror will win. The fear of no deal, the irrational fear of no deal, will win. It may take 2 passes, but it will pass. October 30, 2018, according to Sky. As Davis was saying these words, Steve Baker, who also resigned as a Brexit minister over Chequers, muttered, "Don't say that." The biggest question in Westminster politics at the moment is Davis right? Although Davis is a prominent Brexiter, unlike Baker he is not one of the MPs orchestrating the anti-Chequers campaign through the European Research Group, the Tory caucus pushing for a harder Brexit. He was expressing an opinion, not signaling a climb down on behalf of a faction he leads. Indeed, he is still one of the 51 MPs listed on the. If those 51 Tory MPs hold firm, and assuming Labour votes against any proposed May deal, then it is very, very hard to see how she gets her plan through Parliament. But MPs change their minds. And, as Davis said, the no-deal terror could be persuasive. UDPAT. Davis subsequently posted a tweet clarifying what he thinks on this. C 11:20 a.m. Update ends. More of this, no doubt, at PMQs. There is a lot else around today too. Here is the agenda. 9:15 a.m. Sir David Natzler, Clerk of the Commons, gives evidence to the Commons Brexit Committee about how the Brexit meaningful vote could proceed. 9:30 a.m. Michael Gove, the Environment Secretary, gives evidence to the Commons Environment Committee about the Agriculture Bill. 9:45 a.m. Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, speaks at a National Police Chiefs Council and Association of Police and Crime Commissioners joint summit. 12 p.m. Theresa May faces Jeremy Corbyn at PMQs. 2:15 p.m. Robert Choate, head of the Office for Budget Responsibility, gives evidence to the Commons Treasury Committee about the budget. 2:30 p.m. Simon Stevens, Chief Executive of NHS England, gives evidence to the Commons Public Accounts Committee about mental health services for children and young people. 2:30 p.m. Sharon White, Ofcom's Chief Executive, and Lord Burns, its Chair, give evidence to the Commons Culture Committee about fake news. 2:45 p.m. Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, gives evidence to the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. As usual, I will also be covering breaking political news as it happens, as well as bringing you the best reaction, comment and analysis from the web. I plan to post a summary when I wrap up, probably around 5:30 p.m. Here is the Politico Europe roundup of this morning's political news. And here is the Politik-Schaum list of today's top 10 must-reads. If you want to follow me or contact me on Twitter, I'm on @AndrewSparrow. I try to monitor the Commons VTL, but normally I find it impossible to read them all. If you have a direct question, do include Andrew in it somewhere and I'm more likely to find it. I do try to answer direct questions, although sometimes I miss them or don't have time. If you want to attract my attention quickly, it is probably better to use Twitter. Updated at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time.